artificial intelligence and its growing influence on the music industry. AI is transforming how we create, distribute, and consume music, from AI-driven music composition and production tools to personalized streaming services. The opportunities seem endless. It's truly revolutionary in scope. However, with these advancements come significant questions and challenges, especially around intellectual property and copyright for creators, and some issues around ethics and ethical issues. We are going to navigate these complex yet very exciting developments with our esteemed guest, John Phelan, who is the head of the International Confederation of Music Publishers, which serves as the global trade body for the music publishing industry. John has vast experience and deep insights into both the creative and business sides of music. His background is steeped in music. You were a professional performer and have studied orchestral conducting at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, but you've also studied law and lectured at universities such as the Paris School of Business Management, which makes you uniquely positioned to discuss how AI is reshaping the music landscape and what it all means for artists, publishers, and consumers alike. So, John, thank you for joining us today. How are songwriters using AI today? I mean, is it transforming the creative process?
Thank you very much, Theo, and thank you so much for the warm and generous welcome. Great to be here with Means and Ways to talk about what's a really timely topic. And I just want to say a big thank you also to Publishers Canada, our national group, with whom we're here in Canada to talk about these issues and with government. So to your question, for sure it is changing things. Like technology has always changed the creative process. So songwriters and composers are the direct artistic partners of music publishers. They help create the most important part of the music process, creating new music. And AI, which is really an umbrella term for lots of different services and applications and technologies, and hopefully we can delve into that today, is changing that creative process for sure. There are ways in which composers and songwriters are going into studios and using these new technologies to help, kick off songwriting ideas in the studio. That's already happening. That's a real marketplace activity. But also, there's also ways in which the technology is being adopted into live performance. So I always think a lot of people struggle to wrap their head around what does artificial intelligence really mean? Give us some examples. There's an amazing example in the Sphere, which is a new venue out in Las Vegas that U2 recently opened a few months ago. And what they're doing with that incredible dome, which is entirely a television screen, is they're working with Ez Devlin, the famous Broadway visual artist, and she's using AI to create these spectacular, large-scale visual effects to supplement the performance of the band. And so therefore it's a good example of generative AI, which is, comes with pros and cons. And I would just encourage everyone to check out that U2 Sphere show live on YouTube, and you'll really get a sense of what's possible with this technology. There's also lots of other different ways. There's a beautiful example a couple of months ago where Randy Travis, the famous singer-songwriter, who tragically suffered a very debilitating stroke about 10 years ago and really cannot sing anymore. But he's still got that extraordinary creative mind. And he is now writing his own lyrics, and he's now using AI to help, based on his old recordings, record those new lyrics in his voice, even though he can't sing, and then release new music as Randy Travis and with his band. And that's a beautiful use of these new technologies to help assist the creative process for songwriters and composers. So lots of very exciting things happening out there.
But it's all still very nascent. When you look at the potential going forward, what is the thing that excites you the most about applying AI to music?
I think in that very straightforward, simple question of what excites you most, I think anything which helps more people create more great music. I mean, that might sound sort of trite, but it's really fundamental. Anything which does that has to be a welcome thing. As humans, ever since we've been banging two bits of basalt together, we've wanted to communicate, we've wanted to create, we've wanted to use rhythm and melody as ways of communicating and forming that extraordinary bond of communities that creativity and culture does. And technology has always been very much a bedfellow with the creative process. So I think that any ways that we can legally and carefully and suitably adopt these new technologies to boost that creative process, all the better.
Yeah. Are you worried that musicians will become obsolete? I mean, will it ever truly replicate the human touch in music composition?
No, it won't. It can't. It's a technology, and it doesn't have that spark of genius, that Pythagorean beautiful thing that is creating music. It can't do that. What it can do is, I say, make things more efficient. So take, for example, a technology which will help you orchestrate a very large-scale score. That's a really interesting thing for young composers or maybe not very experienced composers. The technology can help with that. And I think that's a way in which it can do it, but it can never replicate, the human touch or even the human creative process and the performance process. One example I always go back to is the gaming industry, which today drives more revenue back to the music industry than all of the film, TV, and movie business in the US. Gaming is a big business, and a big part of that music revenue is going to composers creating these incredible orchestral scores to gaming. Now, you would think with AI and generative AI, it would be very easy to replace that, but people aren't replacing it. Why? Because they want the really authentic, incredible genius that comes with human creation. They don't want audible algorithms. So I see it very much as a supplementary process to the creative process, not necessarily a replacement one, even though the replacement one is possible, and those are some of the risks we have to be cognizant of.
But this is not the first technology, the time technology has kind of come in and upended the industry. Some of what you're seeing is probably predictable. What has surprised you about AI that maybe, what's been counterintuitive in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. The technology it just runs right through the creative process, and a lot of these AI companies are using a lot of deliberate rhetoric, for shareholders and investors to say that it's a fantastic new technology. A lot of it isn't new, and a lot of our business has been using AI and technologies in different ways. I think what has perhaps, maybe slightly surprised us is just the sheer scale with which generative AI can be created. Piracy is a big thing in the music sector. It hasn't gone away. And generative AI makes that problem all the more exponential. We live in a globalized, digitized business where people can get music onto global platforms instantaneously. That's a good thing. But also comes with risks that, if we don't get the Gen AI aspect right, that illegal music will, become an increasing problem. But don't let anybody tell you that AI is abstract or nebulous or some kind of strange concept. It's very practical, and it's in the business already, for better and for worse.
I mean, what types of technologies are we talking about here? I mean, and are any of these technologies or apps or companies providing these services, are there any game changers here? Any specific ones that are potentially game changers?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is where we really start to, the most important question for me is, what is artificial intelligence? Because really it's an umbrella term for lots of different technologies and apps and services. So to answer your question, yes, there are sort of lots of examples. We see kind of 5 areas when we're trying to demystify AI, in terms of 5 areas of market activities here. One is the AI being used to assist the creative process that I've mentioned earlier. Secondly, when we see AI being used on a business-to-business level, trying to find, say, through a large data set of music, the right song for your ad campaign, that's something that's not new. And then we see 3 other areas which are linked, which is the ability to ingest huge amounts of music, then to train it, and then to generate off the back of it. So those are kind of 5 areas that we see within AI. But there's lots of different ways within those 5 types of activities where there has been game changers. One example is just a couple of months ago, Brian Eno, the wonderful producer and composer from London, with an incredible body of work, has released that work on an app alongside Orbital, fantastic London-based electro DJ band. And you can now, as a user, use the app to engage with all of the repertoire that both of those composers and artists have released to create new audio. That's a great and pretty cool use of new technologies.
And how prevalent is it? Like how are we listening to it and we don't even know it exists on the radio or on Spotify? And will we get to a point where every single piece of music will have some AI component of some sort?
It's a great question. Will we get to a point where every piece of music? No, I don't think so, because I think simply, there's the joy of the creative process and the joy of creating music together. I mean, who really wants to go into a room and just use algorithms to create a product, an output? There's nothing beautiful about that. There's nothing romantic about that. There's nothing. Why would you do it? So I don't think it will replace things. That being said, when we're talking about AI music, people throw this term around a lot, AI music. Again, it's not instructive. It covers a multitude of different types of music on a range from purely machine-generated works, so when computers and algorithms are creating audio, all the way to, say, someone using AI just as an assistant process to the overall human process. And so therefore, on the machine-generated work side, that's a big risk that might replace music in other commercial spheres, say on broadcast or radio. You know, that's something our industry's been very, very vigilant of, that machine-generated works don't flood the digital or broadcast marketplace. And that's going to be a risk for years to come.
I mean, if you looked at your crystal ball, if you can predict these things in 10 years from now, what do you think would be the significant change brought forward by AI?
I think the significant change is more in the business side than the creative side, if I'm being frank. Why? Because our industry, to be honest, the music industry has been adopting AI and AI type services for many years now. And so I do think AI is going to make things more efficient. It's going to make it more cost effective. Again, to put a finer point on this, I remember what someone once said to me, AI is just everything that doesn't work yet. The rest is just software. And there's a real kernel of truth in that, AI is really, what is it? It's a set of automated softwares which can use data sets and compare those data sets at an enormously vast scale and incredible speeds in order to create results and outputs. So that's, something very interesting for our industry, which is built on data. So we're going to find ways in which we can, and we are finding ways already, to adopt AI in 10 years' time, maybe licensing practices. You take YouTube, there's 14 billion videos on YouTube. Billions of those videos have music to them, which is licensed. Each one of those music tracks has a whole set of metadata necessary to recognize the music and get creators paid. And that's applicable to every streaming service that you can think of, and all the trillions of iterations of data there. I think that's one example area in which AI as a technology can definitely be adopted to help licensing processes, make things more efficient on the business side. And on the creative side, for sure, we're going to see more and more adoption in the studio. But will it ever replace things? Not wholly.
Will we get like a new genre of music, like the way radio, for example, brought us kind of the short song, the hit song?
Yeah.
Are we going to get something fundamentally different?
You can. I mean, it's a tool, so you can use it whatever way you want. So when we were investigating this years ago in the office and amongst our team, we came up with some real mongrel music, when you can throw in Scottish folk music and, Bulgarian electro with, Brazilian flamenco into a verbal prompt into an AI model. It's going to throw you something out. Whether that's interesting or not is a different question.
Most of these models are being trained on Western music. I mean, could that marginalize non-Western music? I mean, will it homogenize music potentially? Is that a risk?
I don't think it will homogenize things. I think there's two answers to your question. Back when the internet arrived 25, 26 years ago, everyone said the arrival of digital music was just going to homogenize everything. We'd all be listening to Anglo-American music in a number of years. The total opposite is true. Everywhere you look, in most places, most markets, people are listening to more and more local music. That's an incredible thing, So the internet and the digital music market that our industry licenses, we license about 170 million different music tracks. And that's not diluting things. It's not homogenizing things. It's giving you the ability to wake up in the morning and listen to a Sibelius symphony or the latest BTS K-pop. I think AI is going to enable that, to continue to occur. So new genres, genres come from people. The tool will just help the efficiency of that process, I think.
Do you think AI will make it more likely that songwriting will be a more secluded, lonely experience? You can be alone with your computer. I mean, will it kill the band?
Will it kill the band? Yeah, that's been a prediction over a number of years, eh? Yeah. And bands are resilient, thank goodness. Will it kill the band? I think the opposite. I mean, just on the top of my head, you sparked a thought. I remember the National, wonderful bands talking about their latest album, which was entirely created at distance. These guys are now all, fathers of kids and busy lives. They created the entire album from distance. Technology provided that. Ableton, Pro Tools, all the different ways in the studio that composers and songwriters make music. I'm just going to demystify this. AI is just another way of doing that. So will it make it more lonesome? I mean, that's possible now. And we see in the Canadian music market the incredible diaspora effect whereby Canadian producers are working with Indian songwriters and vice versa. Technology is doing that. And again, AI is just going to do it faster and cheaper.
But there seems to be scope, as you mentioned, for AI to change the relationship between creator and its audience. Do you think could be transformative, that relationship, whether it's personalization, personalizing fan experience, or just the way streaming services allow you to kind of target specific listeners?
Yeah, it will be transformative, but to a degree. Why do we listen to music? We want that enjoyment and a profound pleasure that comes from listening to the music. We want to engage with other humans. And that's why, again, I come back to my point about the arrival of the internet 25 years ago, diluting everything. Look at the live music industry. It's bigger than ever. More money's coming in than ever. Why? Because people want to engage with humans and live performance and that communal thing, which is so central to music making. Will there be an area in the music business for AI to help engagement of artists with their fans? Yes, it's already happening. So, ways in which generative AI by artists, legal and licensed generative AI, can help them engage with their fans, and maybe with pre-release and, on a premium service, being able to get a video message or an interactive engagement with an artist, which is Gen AI. That's all possible and indeed happening.
And I mean, on the business side, could it provide new revenue streams? I mean, is there potential to for music publishing? Is there a potential for AI to create new business?
Yes, but we have to be very careful here, because AI, again, I mentioned those 5 activity areas. There's the kind of B2B level where we're using AI to exchange data sets, to license, to administer, all of those kind of technical things within the industry. That's going to help, cost effectiveness and speed and so on. So there's ways in which music publishers will be able to find business efficiencies with AI. There's no doubt about that. The big concern in the business today, globally, and the reason why we're here in Canada and traveling the world to meet governments, is the concern around Gen AI and the risk that presents, that generative AI, when it's unlicensed and done illegally, which is what's happening today, that will not only not provide revenue stream to songwriters, composers, and publishers, but indeed, we'll put a block on that, the genie leaving the bottle, so to speak. So if we get things right, if we get the big tectonic plates moving in the right direction, there's definitely opportunity. And one of the real nuances about music publishing is that music publishers are involved in every form of music exploitation. So whether it's broadcast, TV, streaming, there's always a music publisher involved. So we get the Gen AI stuff right, then surely music publishers and their songwriters, composers can get more revenue from it for sure.
All right, so let's talk about some of these copyright challenges. I mean, take off your musician hat and put on your lawyer professional hat. I mean, just maybe lay out for us in broad terms what are the big copyright issues and intellectual property challenges that you're facing.
Yeah, I'm gonna be a bit cheeky here and answer your question in the words of Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI himself. We have an IP. OpenAI has an IP problem. Respect for copyright and the exclusive rights that involves, meaning you need to get permission from songwriters and composers and publishers and rights holders before you use people's work. That is such a fundamental tenet of commercial use of music. You need to get permission beforehand so that the right people can get paid for their creative work. That's copyright in its nutshell. And we have an enormous problem whereby AI companies, so third-party AI companies, which are driving a lot of money at the moment, but also big tech companies with AI divisions, they are frankly following a maxim of maximum content, minimum responsibility. They don't want to pay. And so they're flipping copyright on its head and ingesting, as they like to say, training and generating this generative AI music without a license. As we sit here today, there isn't a music publisher in the world that has a deal with an AI company for the commercial use of music anywhere. And the reason for that is not that our industry doesn't want to license, is that AI companies flatly refuse their responsibilities under law to take a license with composers and songwriters And there's no legal, commercial, or ethical, or moral excuse for that to happen. And it's happening.
And there's really kind of two issues or three issues, as you mentioned. You have the kind of the input side of things, where the testing and the training that they're using
Yep.
on the when they're the data aggregators and the tech companies train their models, they infringe on copyright, but also on the output side, right? Whether it's what they call deep fakes or identity theft in some ways. I mean, can you kind of elaborate on specifically kind of these the various aspects of how these tech companies may be using the data without permission?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about generative AI, that's the way that we get there, through those three steps: ingestion, training, so large language models and how they train and compare these big data sets, and then the generative AI, the output, so to speak. Now, those are process descriptions I'm describing. You can do that in a legal way. Think about the U2 example, think about the Randy Travis example. There's a million ways you can do that if you choose to do it correctly. AI is not a sentient thing. It's just a technology. AI does not choose whether to respect copyright or not. It doesn't have a mind of its own. Companies choose whether to respect copyright or not. And the reality is these big tech companies and AI-specific companies are, for purely commercial reasons, refusing to recognize their liabilities under copyright for the access, training, and generation. And we see a lot of companies that do all of those three activity areas to create Gen AI. Some of them offshore it, so they offshore it to people just to do the ingestion or the scraping. Some people just do the training, and some people just do the generation, and many do the whole thing. But the whole point is those stages of Gen AI and artificial intelligence practices need to be licensed. And we sometimes need to call out these AI companies when they deliberately anthropomorphize this. They like to befuddle governments. They like to befuddle rights holders by saying things like ingestion, hallucination, generation. AI shouldn't be anthropomorphized. It's a technology, and people are making commercial decisions it's not ingestion, it's scraping. So if you take YouTube today and you find any piece of music on there, if you download that from YouTube, put it in your pocket and take it away, we call that stream ripping. And what these companies are doing is stream ripping on an enormous scale, and that's what we need to stop.
Okay, so what type of regulatory framework is necessary to get this right?
It's a great question. Copyright law works well. When this really started to come to the fore about 5-6 years ago, at ICMP, we analysed every piece of copyright law nationally we could get our hands on, plus international copyright law at European level, plus the treaties at WIPO level, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which has treaties in copyright. And without wanting to oversimplify, the conclusion really was that copyright law and the fundamental principles of exclusive rights, when we say exclusive, we don't mean prevention, we mean the permission has to be gotten first before it can be used. These copyright laws are pretty robust and tech neutral, and they're really built well to cater for AI and the many different forms of AI. And in Canada, the copyright law is very well drafted, very robust, very suitable to these AI activities. So we don't need to revise copyright law. We just need to get the AI companies to observe copyright law. Can we do more? Yes. So there are governments, in fact, more than 70 governments around the world, considering AI legislation of various kinds. And what we've been doing is trying to encourage an enforcement aspect to this. Double down on the fact that we will decimate our creative industries if we don't get basic copyright law sorted. So respect the existing copyright law and maybe bring in better enforcement mechanisms against infringement.
Like what? What type of, what would these enforcement mechanisms look like?
Yeah, I said earlier, there's no legal, commercial, or indeed moral excuse for the commercial use of music without a license. And so if you take, for example, just this morning I was reading the FT over breakfast, and Jonathan Cantor, who's the antitrust leader with the DOJ down in the US, he has called, quote unquote, for urgent scrutiny about the monopolization of AI by big tech companies. So that's a very interesting and very appropriate angle to look at this from a competition angle. Because what we're seeing is the world's biggest companies grabbing not some, not a lot, but the entire repertoire of the world. All music, ingesting it, training it, and generating. That's a competition problem. And so competition law should look at this and look at how AI companies are presenting a threat to the creative industries. We can also look at it from a contract side. So digital music services that everyone's familiar with, they shouldn't be enabling scraping of music from their services to happen. But indeed, on the EU side, we've got enforcement and sanctions in the recently passed EU AI deal, and they're going to fine companies if they don't observe the laws there. And there's a number of set of different provisions within the EU AI Act, the world's first piece of AI legislation, which will tackle these issues and bring better enforcement in these areas.
And is that the standard bearer? What the Europeans are doing, is that sufficient? Do you think to solve this problem?
It's really meaningful. The EU AI Act is an I'm going to say an excellent piece of legislation. Why? Because it doesn't revise copyright law. What it does do is it clarifies that these AI companies of all kinds, they call them general purpose AI in the legislation, but that's a catch-all term for all of the ones I've mentioned, the scrapers, the trainers, and the generative ones. These general purpose AI companies must respect the existing European copyright law. And that simple sentence covers a multitude, brings us back to the basic principles of prior authorization, transparency, responsibility. More than that, the EU AI Act builds in a whole series of sanctions, so transparency. What we're seeing in the marketplace today is that big tech companies are looking for the country of lowest protection. Singapore is a pretty problem market, to scrape as much music as they can, ship it on to another country for the large language model training, then doing the generative AI and passing that on into Europe and indeed globally. The EU AI Act will put a stop to that. That will basically say, it doesn't matter if the training was done in Singapore, you have to be transparent about the fact that it was done in Singapore, and more importantly, what are you training on? That's the big question that every single tech company and AI company must answer. What are you training your content on? You didn't get it, didn't fall down the chimney to you, and it didn't come from Mars. So where are you getting that content from? And the EU Act will help address those issues and problems, which are gargantuan. It affects every music publisher, every songwriter, every publisher, every label, every artist is affected by these copyright infringing practices.
Yeah. What's the regulatory landscape in Canada? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, the copyright law it's robust, it's tech neutral, it works, it has all the central principles that we need in there. So our National Industry Association colleagues at Music Publishers Canada and APM, and as well as ICMP, we're feeding information to the government about, we don't need the revised copyright law, but what we can do is provide evidence-based examples of what we're seeing in the marketplace, the pros, the cons, the risks, the opportunities. And what we need to stop is this commercial scale infringement. So in Canada, not much needs done. If Canada was to bring in some form of regulation, which would basically be a binding guideline to AI companies to observe copyright, or to double down on things like transparency of model training, bring in fines for copyright infringement, those would all be welcome things. But we certainly don't need to reinvent the wheel.
And is the concern, tech companies are lobbying for exemptions from certain copyright provisions. Is that the concern?
Yes. Tech companies will, I'm going to say it categorically, use and abuse exceptions everywhere they can find them. We've been through this battle many times before. When Google acquired YouTube back in 2007, they took what was called a safe harbor exemption. So when you talk about an exemption, just for viewers, that means you don't have a copyright liability if you're entitled to an exception. You don't have to pay people. YouTube claimed this because it said that it was not responsible for uploading the content. It was the users who were uploading the content. Now that's clearly a willful abuse of the intention of the law. And they were doing that to avoid paying people. Many years later, YouTube, now thanks to Article 17 and similar services, Facebook, TikTok, Triller, they're all licensed because of the clarifications that those exceptions don't apply. What we're seeing in AI is the same approach. These big tech companies are trying to maximize and abuse exemptions from copyright law in order to deliver their business target, which is maximum content, minimum responsibility, maximum commercial value for them, lowest payment to songwriters and composers, and that needs to stop.
But is it really enforceable, even if we had these more stringent? Actually, you seem to be suggesting that we don't necessarily even need new legislation. Is it enforceable given the legislation we have?
I think it is enforceable, and it's enforceable in a number of ways. Copyright law comes with responsibilities, and what we're seeing is a lot of companies are taking cases already under copyright law against these companies. Our own members at Universal Music Publishing and Concord Music Publishing are taking a case in the US against Anthropic, which is an AI company, which is copyright infringing all of the songwriters and composers' works within Universal and Concord. And that case is being heard at the moment. We are very optimistic about a positive result. We're very confident in that result. There are cases elsewhere in the world. Just last month in China, in the Guangzhou Internet Courts, there was the world's first ever copyright infringement finding against a generative AI visual character. That's a welcome restatement of the law. So we're going to see more and more meaningful cases which will really double down on this and make sure that the AI companies get their act together. What we will also see under the EU AI Act is a brand new AI office. That's a really unusual thing because the EU normally can't enforce its own laws, apart from in competition law. But now with its new AI Act legislation, it's not just made a legal framework, it's made a new office to enforce that legal framework. And they're going to monitor, are these AI companies playing ball? Are they being transparent? Are they observing copyright? And if they're not, they're going to fine them up to 7% of global annual turnover. So that's meaningful.
My kids are on TikTok all the time. I mean, can you kind of connect the two? How does TikTok I guess, is it in that gray zone as far as copyright is concerned? I mean, what is going on there?
No, it's not in the gray zone. TikTok is one of our licensed music partners. All of our member companies license TikTok. That's a great thing. Why is it great? Because creators can get their music out to a totally global audience. And music fans, as importantly, can engage with that music of every kind. And most importantly, the songwriters and composers can get paid. Is there a gray zone? No. If you are providing commercial music without a license, you're infringing copyright. In Europe, about 5 years ago, there was a big piece of legislation called Article 17 passed, which clarified TikTok's liable under copyright. And you know, these companies, they do their best to avoid their liabilities, but there's no doubt about it. And recently, Universal Music Publishing Group withdrew all of its content from TikTok. So upset were they by the lowballing of the value of the license that TikTok was offering. And it used Article 17 to make sure that that content wasn't appearing on the platform. And then also the principal concern with Universal was that TikTok was threatening to release lots of machine-generated works onto its platform. I come back to what I mentioned earlier about the different types of AI music. If you've got lots of machine-generated works flooding onto those platforms, that's a real and present risk for Universal songwriters and composers. So there's an example of a big company using the legislation to meaningful effect to help drive up value for songwriters and composers.
And what does the regulatory framework look like in the U.S.? Like, what's can we have real change or real progress on this issue if the Americans aren't on board?
I think the question is, do we need real change? I come back to the copyright law aspect. Let's take two fundamentals of it. Exclusive rights, you need permission, that applies. So, we're well set to take on AI in that regard. There are exceptions to copyright in the US. They have a fair use exception. And of course, the AI companies are claiming, that they're entitled to fair use. That just doesn't pass muster. It doesn't pass any scrutiny. There are 4 conditions to be entitled to a fair use exception, and these guys fall short of at least 3 of them, likely all 4 of them. So the challenge in the US is more getting observance of existing copyright law, calling out the nonsense that, fair use doesn't apply when it comes to using commercial music on these platforms. And, post-election, let's see what might happen. But as an industry, we're not gunning for change, We don't need a huge overhaul of copyright laws. What we need to see is just the companies taking their responsibilities and taking a license. Take X. X is totally unlicensed for music, and that's unacceptable. And that's the kind of change we need to see, proper deals being put in place.
Yeah, but as I mentioned, I mean, it's not the first time a technology has upended the industry. In the past, you've dealt with it mostly successfully. You've dealt with these sorts of challenges, technological challenges. What's different this time? Is it more ominous this time? Is it more difficult? What is? You're dealing with large, massive tech companies, right? How does that change things?
Yeah, these are gargantuan. I use the word cautiously, opponents. These are the world's biggest companies. Just yesterday, NVIDIA took over. Apple is the world's largest, highest, most valued company. And NVIDIA is an AI company driving mostly hardware, but also software. The trade bodies for the tech companies in Brussels spent more than 100 million euro last year in terms of advocacy. And they're doing it also in different ways. They're hiring Potemkin trade bodies as well too, to indirectly affect the legislative process. That's deeply concerning, and we've been seeing that for many, many years. I think the good news is for our members and across the music industry is they're losing. All of the big legislative fights on Article 17, on the Digital Services Act, and indeed on the EU AI Act, the music sector has prevailed. And I think that's great, and long may that continue.
And when you look at, these past kind of situations, these precedents, I mean, is there anything that you can learn from the past that will allow you to address these challenges going forward?
Yeah, big time. I mean, go back to the Article 17 legislative campaign. Jimmy Damich, the European Parliament spokesperson, he said it was the most heavily lobbied legislation in European Union history. When you think about all the things that the EU legislates on, that's a remarkable thing. We saw tens of millions of euro being spent by tech companies to get this legislation off the table. We saw Wikipedia black out its homepage for 3 days before the European Parliament voted, claiming that copyright would be incursion of freedom of expression. Total nonsense. Wikipedia was excluded from the law. Wikimedia did receive $3.2 million from Google a few months beforehand as well too. So there's a lot of very, real risks to the advocacy process. We need to be very cognizant of astroturfing, as we call it, the kind of indirect representation of big tech interests around various capitals. That's a big thing to be aware of. The bottomless resources. Google and Microsoft have put together a fund to defend Gen AI users and suppliers from claims of copyright infringement around the world. That's scandalous. These are the world's biggest companies saying we will defend in court people who are taking our industry and composers and songwriters' content without a license. We'll fight them in court. These are the kinds of things we need to put to bed.
But how do you counter kind of the tech industry's kind of argument that you don't want regulation to be stifling innovation?
Yeah, we need to be careful about vernacularizing all of these things. And what are the synonyms here? What do they mean by, careful about stifling innovation? That simply means they don't want any responsibilities. They don't want laws, they want responsibilities. Why is it that no tech company has a deal in place today with the music industry, despite the fact that the big tech companies want this music, because music is one of the most extraordinary industries in the world. And so we need to be very careful about the idea that this will hamper innovation. These companies ain't got no problem with market value or market share. The old, claims, nonsense claims back in Article 17 was that if we passed it, it would break the internet. I think the internet's doing just fine.
Yeah. How critical would be regulation that forces these tech companies to be transparent about how critical is that?
That's a huge, huge issue. As an industry, we're built on data. We need good data to make sure that all of the world's millions of songwriters and composers can get paid. In the publishing industry, the global average of remuneration for our industry back to songwriters and composers is 70-30. Take 170 million different tracks. That's a lot of composers and songwriters to get paid. We need the data to do that. The big problem is a lot of these platforms are totally non-transparent about what they're training on, and they're grabbing it from social media platforms, the music, they're stripping the metadata out of it, then they're training on it, then they're making generative AI, and they're being totally untransparent, not partially, totally untransparent about where they're getting this data from. They need to answer the question, every one of them, what are you training on and where did you get the content? And once they answer that, and we think we know the answer, then they need to be providing transparency about those data sets and the content that they're using.
And how can you prove that they are using, what data they're using? How can you show that?
Yeah, well, there's many ways.
Are you using AI?
We are using AI, yeah, absolutely. I've talked about it in business examples. We use AI in the music business for many years, and one area we're using AI is against AI infringement. So we're using technologies to chase unlicensed music around the internet and get it down off the internet. How else can you find out? There's a lot of businesses out there, what we call automated content recognition technology companies. What they do is they're specialized software that on all the radio stations around the world, all the digital services, all the billions and trillions of iterations of music usage, the content recognition service companies, they can recognize all of that music usage and help us get the right people get paid. We can use that kind of technology in AI to assess the data sets. I talked about the EU AI Act. It will have a binding obligation for AI companies to be transparent about where they got their data sets from, even if it was anywhere else in the world. That's a big deal. And at the end of the day, the best form of transparency is a license. All of these companies need, under law and morally, to take a license for the work, and then we can be transparent and make the market succeed.
And are you calling on the Canadian government to do the same here? I mean, is there an equivalent for Canada?
Yeah, I think our job here for the Canadian government is threefold. One, it's to provide an assessment of copyright law and how that works, and I've said about how that's robust and works well. I think the second thing is to demystify AI. It's amazing how many leading experts and market experts, governments, even people within the industry who need AI to be demystified and to be really explained what are the market practices we're seeing. And in the music industry, we're seeing a huge encroachment of AI into our business. And so therefore, that's the second big job, is to inform the Canadian government of what's happening around the world. And a part of that as well too is informing about the tactics of AI and big tech companies. And the third thing we're doing is recommending better enforcement, better transparency, and better sanctions for misuse and abuse of the laws. I just want to zero in on that second element of what big tech companies are doing. They always say you can't bring in new laws because it will hamper innovation, it's too complicated, too hard, and so on and so forth. And, just let us get on with it. We took a look at the terms and conditions of every single AI company we could get our hands on. We took a look at the open AI policies, the stability AI policies, Google's policy, Meta's policies, X policies, YouTube's policies. And if you dig into those policies, you will find, in no uncertain terms, categoric preventions of users of these services to access, train, reproduce, modify, create, make copies of, and generate off the content that these platforms are providing. That is the epitome and goes to the core of the problem. It's perfectly possible to do the right thing. These companies are choosing not to do the right thing, and they're also prohibiting other people from engaging in the exact same behaviors that they're doing.
And you're confident that the Canadian court system and Canadian legislation will be able to deal with this going forward?
Yeah, I think whether it's a question for the Canadian courts, we'll yet to see. We're not aware of case law at this moment in time. But I know it's a global industry, and we're all being very cognizant and waiting carefully for the rulings in the Anthropic case I mentioned in the US, the Getty Images case in London, big case coming in Berlin, in the Leon case for the photography industry. I think those will tell a lot. That's what we're keeping our eye on at the moment.
And you're not worried that regulation or new legislation could be too sweeping? Somebody mentioned, could it cover bands kind of be swept up by any kind of too sweeping legislation?
Yeah, legislation can be too sweeping, but that's our job, is to shape it appropriately to protect songwriters, composers, and publishers. It has to be said that AI is a sector much broader than music, and the EU AI Act, or in India where they're considering a digital AI Act, or in China where they've brought out AI guidelines, they all tackle many areas of business way beyond copyright and the music business. So that's it is sweeping necessarily by legislation, but I think within music it's really coming back to the core principles and the core process of prior authorization, transparency, etc.
And so, from a business perspective, how is AI changing the way music publishing is done?
Yeah, it's changing it in a couple of ways. It's changing, I mentioned copyright enforcement. It's providing us the ability to go after huge areas of unlicensed music in big numbers. So that technology is happening. It's helping many of our member companies' business clients to find the right music for an ad campaign. I mentioned how we have 170 million tracks. Some companies have millions of songs on their databases. You can now use AI to put in a verbal prompt of find me, something which sounds like the Beatles, it's a bit more upbeat, all sorts of complicated questions. Maybe it has a techno element. You can add anything you want and help you find the right song. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about songs and finding, great music, and that's definitely helping on the B2B level.
I want to talk a little quickly about the ethical dimension of AI outside of copyright. Is there, what are the ethical issues? Could we be seeing job displacement, for example, or will there be questions around artistic integrity? I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I think there's a few, again, AI is such a catch-all term here, there's a few different ways in which that's transparent. It's happening in the sort of, the frontline press. People will have seen the Katy Perry incident, where there was a generative AI image of Katy Perry supposedly attending the Met Gala ball, and even her own mother texted Katy saying, you look great in your dress, and she was saying, I wasn't there, I wasn't present, and generative AI was implicating. That's a really concerning thing for for how people's image and personality rights are being abused. We have to be very careful about that. That's an ethical thing. I think also the way in which the artist's images can be distorted and manipulated, that needs to stop. And thankfully in the EU AI Act, we've now got an obligation, the deep fakes, as they're called, must be labelled. And people must be able to tell what is a deep fake and not. And it's not up to AI companies to just do what they want anymore.
And how about just people on YouTube, just a individual user? Could they be swept up by this sort of regulation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big distinction to make here between what we call user-generated content, meaning that, and we love this stuff because it means you can take music from YouTube and you can upload your video and you can mix music together within the licensed environment that our companies and industry provides to YouTube. That's what we call user-generated content. It's a great thing, It's creativity, user reviews. It's a wonderful digital licensed environment. That's one thing, but I think we need to be very careful of either individuals or companies more often using the value of a songwriter composer's profile or work to profit from it. That just is totally unacceptable.
And back to the ethical issues, are you worried about job displacement? I mean, are we going to be seeing musicians struggling even more than they already are?
Yeah, I mean, our fundamental job at the end of the day is really two things: protecting the rights of musicians and driving value. And we work really damn hard to make sure that legislation encourages better respect for copyright and value. Technology has always, to a degree, displaced jobs, but when we talk about displacement, it's really total replacement of the process. And I think in many other sectors, I was reading just yesterday morning about how in the legal business in the UK, basically ancillary legal service providers, the kinds of people who provide lots of draft contracts and NDAs, AI is taking over a lot of that. I think we're going to see more and more of that kind of displacement. I still think when it comes to the creative process, it's certainly not possible to replicate or displace the human genius of music creation. But we may see, some effects in terms of production, how music gets technically made. That may be a factor. Wait and see.
And it's reducing the cost potentially, so it has the potential to democratize in a way, get more people involved in music production. I mean, if you were advising a young songwriter today, I mean, how would you suggest they prepare for a future where AI is playing a significant role in music? I mean, do they have to become tech experts?
Get a publisher, I mean, the clue's in the name of what our industry does in terms of publishing. It's an incredibly vibrant and an enormous music world out there, and getting yourself heard is hard. So if you've got creative talent and you've got a creative genius, you need a business partner to help you be heard in that process. So I think the first thing to do is get good business advice and good legal advice. That's always been true. Do you need to be a tech expert in terms of AI? It can be, it can be advisable, but it's certainly not a must do.
Last question. We're trying to talk about best case. We want to talk about best case scenarios here. What is the optimal outcome for the industry as far as AI is concerned, and not just for the industry, but also for music listeners as well?
Yeah, I think on those two levels, respect for copyright. We talk about artificial intelligence, and there's a real element here of the AI companies wanting to entice a lot of the VC money which is flowing into the sector. Sam Altman is now asking for $7 trillion in terms of funding to his own company. We see a lot of that going on, and we can talk about artificial intelligence, but it's not abstract. We need artificial intelligence and real rights. That's the most best case scenario, is that we have a development of AI that respects copyright and respects the rights of creators and composers. That's the best case scenario on that side for sure. And then for music fans, that's an interesting one. When you look at the data of sound-alikes, so when you have one artist, singing like another artist, it tends to be a big novelty element to this. Kids are going on TikTok and Instagram and, having Ariana Grande singing Johnny Cash songs, and this big spike of novelty, then it kind of peels off a bit. So, maybe we'll see that novelty element sort of die off, and, people will just go back to the original works. But best case for them as well too is there's just more great music which is properly and fully licensed to get into global audiences.
Great. Thank you very much, John. I mean, that's a wrap for us. I just want to thank John for sharing his insights with us today. It's clear that AI is not just a technological trend. It's a transformative force that's reshaping the industry. But it's also pretty clear that we need to ensure the rights of creators are respected and valued. So it's an exciting time for the industry, and your insights, really, I think, provided a deeper understanding of the path forward. To the audience, I want to thank you for tuning in. We hope you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. Stay tuned for more conversations at Means and Ways. Until next time.